I stood at the living room window, watching the fall leaves swirl in the air before settling on the perfectly trimmed lawn. My house on Elm Street in Lawrence had always been considered one of the best maintained in the neighborhood. Today was my 68th birthday, but the birthday celebration was more anxiety-inducing than joyful. I adjusted my tie, looking at my reflection in the window pane. The wrinkles that furrowed my face seemed to have grown deeper over the past year. My gray hair was neatly combed back, and my gray-blue eyes looked tired but attentive. I turned away from the window and looked around the spacious living room. Everything was ready for the guests. Starched tablecloths, silverware polished to a shine, crystal glasses. I'd always appreciated order. The sound of the front door opening brought me out of my reverie. I brought flowers for the centerpiece. The voice of Audrey Falls, my longtime friend, echoed through the house. I hope you like them. Audrey entered the living room holding a bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums. Her gray hair was gathered into a simple bundle, and a soft smile played across her face. She was dressed in an elegant navy-colored dress, one of what I called her battle outfits. "You look beautiful, Audrey," I said, accepting the bouquet. "And you look like you're going to a job interview, not your own birthday party." She looked critically at my austere suit. "Couldn't you have worn something more colorful?" I grinned. At my age, bright clothes look like I'm trying to look young. "At your age," Audrey mocked me, "you can wear anything, and no one will judge you." She walked to the kitchen, where the appetizers were already laid out. "The catering did a great job," she said, tasting one of the canapes. "You could afford a chef, though." "Why would I need a chef?" I put the chrysanthemums in a vase. "I'm perfectly capable of doing it myself." "Yes, of course," Audrey rolled her eyes. "That's why you only have frozen dinners and a bottle of ketchup in the fridge." I didn't argue. Since Elizabeth had died 5 years ago, home-cooked meals had really stopped being my priority. Sometimes I felt like I'd lost my zest for life, along with my wife. "Had Aiden called?" Audrey asked, setting down the glasses. I tensed. "He sent me a text this morning. Said he and Helen would be there." "E? That's it," I shrugged. It wasn't his style to shower me with congratulations. Audrey looked at me carefully. "I saw him in town last week," she said carefully. "He looked tense." "When did Aiden not look tense?" I grinned bitterly. "Ekram, he's got a construction company in economically unstable times, an ambitious young wife, and a father who never seemed to understand him. The guy has reason to be tense." Audrey moved closer and put her hand on my shoulder. "That's not what I mean. He looked, I don't know, like he was up to something. And Helen was with him. They were arguing." I frowned. "About what?" "I don't know. I didn't hear it. But I noticed that he was angry and she seemed worried. When they saw me, they shut up and pretended everything was fine. I could feel the anxiety building up inside. My relationship with my son had never been easy, but lately Aiden had become even more aloof. Our last meeting 3 months ago had ended in a cold goodbye. My memory took me back 25 years. Aiden was 10, and he was waiting for me at a school sporting event. I was 2 hours late because of an important client meeting. When I finally arrived, the bleachers were empty, and Aiden was sitting alone on a bench, clutching his silver medal. "I came in second place," the boy said without any joy. "That's great, son," I replied, feeling a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry I'm late. There was an important meeting." "And there's always an important meeting," Aiden interrupted me and walked to the car, leaving me standing there with the gift I'd bought on the way. There were too many moments like that. I always justified myself by saying I was providing for my family, building a future for Aiden. After Elizabeth died when Aiden was 20, our relationship became even more strained. I went into work and Aiden went into his studies and then into starting his own business. We communicated only out of necessity, sharing information but not emotion. The ringing of the doorbell snapped me out of my memories. "I think it's the Gilmores," Audrey said, heading for the door. "They're always the first to arrive." Ray and Lois Gilmore had been my neighbors for 15 years. Ray, a former school teacher, now wrote detective novels, and Lois was a landscaper. They entered carrying a box wrapped in festive paper and a bottle of wine. "Happy birthday, Norman." Lois hugged me. "I can't believe you're already 68. You look 60 at the most. You're flattering the old man," I smiled. "Come on, you're not an old man," Ray said, shaking my hand. You're 3 years younger than I am, and I'm just getting started in life. Other guests arrived. My colleagues from the investment company where I'd worked for 40 years, a few friends from the golf club, a couple of neighbors. About 15 people in all, not too many, but enough to fill the house with voices and laughter. I was a good host, polite, attentive, but the guests sensed that my thoughts were somewhere far away. I often glanced at the clock in the front door, waiting for my son to show up. "He's coming," Audrey said quietly, holding out a glass of whiskey to me. "Stop looking at the door." I gratefully accepted the drink. You know, I always thought Aiden and I would hit it off by this age. Maybe you two should just sit down and talk. Audrey suggested it. No accusations, no excuses. Just talk. I grinned bitterly. You know Aiden. He's too much like me, stubborn and proud. Talking isn't for the likes of us. That's why you're both unhappy, Audrey said. I wanted to answer, but I was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up. Through the living room window, I saw my son's black SUV. Aiden got out from behind the wheel, tall, trim, and wearing an expensive suit. He walked around the car and opened the door for Helen. She was beautiful, slender brunette with cold blue eyes. I've always thought that my son's choice of a wife was guided more by calculation than sentiment. Well, Audrey said, noticing the change in my face, your most important guest has arrived. I straightened, as if I were preparing for a business meeting rather than a meeting with my son. Aiden and Helen entered the house. I saw my son pause in the doorway for a second, looking around at the crowd. Then he crossed the living room, ignoring the greetings of his acquaintances, and came toward me. "Happy birthday," he said in a formal tone, extending his hand for a handshake. "Thank you for coming," I replied, shaking my son's hand. Helen leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. "Happy birthday, Norman." Her perfume was too strong and her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, it's good to see you," I nodded. "Drinks are on the table, appetizers too. Make yourselves at home." Aiden looked at me with an unreadable expression, then took his wife under his arm and headed toward the bar. "Well," Audrey whispered as the young couple stepped away, "that was warm and heartwarming." I sighed. He's here. It was already good. The evening continued. The guests ate, drank, socialized. I moved from group to group, keeping up the conversation, but my gaze kept returning to my son. Aiden kept to himself, occasionally exchanging remarks with guests who came up to say hello. Helen was more social, but I noticed her occasional anxious glances at her husband. During one of these rounds of guests, I heard a snippet of conversation between Aiden and Helen. "Are you sure you want to do this tonight?" Helen whispered. "More than sure," Aiden replied. "It's a good time." They were silent as I approached. I pretended I hadn't heard anything, but my insides clenched with a premonition of trouble. A long time ago, when Aiden was 7, I'd missed his birthday because of a business trip. I'd made up for it with an expensive gift, a kid's electric car that my son had dreamed of, but Aiden refused to get in the car. "I wanted you to be at my party," he said then. "Not the car." Elizabeth tried to smooth things over, but I was angry at my son for being ungrateful. "You don't understand," I said to Aiden then. "I'm working for your future. Someday you'll be grateful for everything I do for you." Aiden looked at me with a childlike seriousness. "I'll never be like you, Daddy." The 7-year-old's words had hurt me more than I was willing to admit. Now, looking at the cold face of my adult son, I realized that Aiden had kept his promise. He'd become the opposite of me in every way except one. He still put work before relationships. "Time to cut the cake," Audrey announced, rolling a table out of the kitchen with a huge chocolate cake decorated with candles. The guests gathered around, raising their glasses and beginning to sing a congratulatory song. I stood at the center of attention, smiling and trying to look happy. I made a wish and blew out the candles to the applause of those gathered. "Speech!" shouted one of the guests. I raised my glass. "Thank you for sharing this evening with me. At my age, every birthday is not only a cause for celebration, but also a time for reflection. I'm grateful for the years I've lived, for the experiences, both good and bad. Grateful for friends," I nodded toward Audrey, "and family." My gaze stopped on Aiden, who looked at me without a smile. Life had taught me that the most valuable things weren't money or status, but relationships with loved ones. Unfortunately, sometimes you learn that wisdom too late. There was silence in the room. Then Ray raised his glass. To Norman, many more years. Everyone drank, and the tension eased a little. The gift-giving began. I received envelopes with gift certificates, bottles of wine, books, and other signs of attention from the guests. I thanked them profusely each time, but inside I was growing uneasy as Aidan and Helen stood aside, not rushing to join in the gift-giving ritual. The living room filled with laughter and conversation. The smoke from the candles still hovered over the newly cut cake, and I sat in my favorite chair, watching with a glass of whiskey in my hand. The music was playing softly, the old jazz songs that Elizabeth and I loved to listen to in the evenings. Audrey moved between the guests, keeping the conversation casual and pouring drinks into empty glasses. She was a wonderful assistant. I couldn't have organized this evening without her. Our friendship, which had begun when we were young, had only grown stronger over the years. Especially after Elizabeth's death, it was Audrey who kept me from becoming completely withdrawn. "How do you like the cake?" she asked, sitting down next to me. I insisted on more chocolate. "Delicious," I smiled. "Like everything you put your hand to." She playfully poked me in the shoulder. "Flatterer? Better tell me, how are you really feeling?" I glanced across the room at Aidan, who was standing by the window with a glass of whiskey, defiantly not participating in the general merriment. Helen was beside him, but her gaze was fixed on the clock hanging on the wall. She was nervously rubbing the silver bracelet on her wrist. "I sense something's wrong," I replied quietly. "They're obviously up to something." "Maybe we should just talk to him," Audrey suggested. "Ask him directly what's wrong." I shook my head. 45 years of being a father had taught me that if Aidan had something in mind, he wouldn't back down until it was done. He and I are alike in that. Ray Gilmore came up to us with a piece of cake in his hand. "Norman, your speech got me thinking. You know, I'm going to use that idea in my new book. A character who realizes the value of family only after losing it." I smiled politely. "I'll be glad to read it when you're done." "Speaking of books," Ray perked up, "I brought you an autographed first edition of The Great Gatsby. I found it at an auction in Chicago." "Ray, that's too generous." "It's nothing," he waved his hand. "You helped my son get into college, remember? I'll never forget that." I nodded. 10 years ago, I'd actually helped Ray's son get a scholarship, using my connections in the financial world. It was one of those rare occasions when money and connections made a real difference. Lois Gilmore joined us holding a small box. "I'd like to present my gift, too." She handed me the elegantly wrapped box. "It's from both of us." I unwrapped it and found an antique compass in a copper frame. "It's beautiful," I said sincerely, twirling the compass in my hands. "It belonged to my grandfather," Lois explained, "a merchant seaman. I thought it would suit you, as someone who always knew exactly where he was going in life." I felt a stab of irony. If only she knew how often I'd lost my way, especially when it came to family. Thank you." I squeezed the compass in my palm. "I'll keep it safe." My gaze shifted to Aidan again. He was watching our conversation with an unreadable expression on his face. When our eyes met, he didn't look away, but he didn't smile either. Instead, he took a sip of whiskey and said something quietly to Helen. I noticed my former coworker Bradley Pierce heading toward them. Bradley was an incorrigible talker, a man who could talk for hours about anything without noticing that the other person had long since lost interest. I almost smiled, imagining how Aidan would get out of this situation. "Aidan!" Bradley clapped my son on the shoulder with such force that the whiskey in his glass shook dangerously. "How's business? I heard you got that contract to renovate the old mall?" Aidan smiled strained. "Yeah, we did. Work starts next month." "Great, great." Bradley was in his element. "I always told Norman you'd be good. I remember when you were just a kid coming into the office. I could see your business acumen." I saw Aidan tense up. He hated those office visits. Elizabeth would sometimes bring him over after school when I was staying late. Aidan would sit in the corner, drawing or reading while I finished my work, and then we'd drive home in silence. Helen set her glass on the windowsill and smiled politely at Bradley. "Sorry, I need to go to the ladies' room." She quickly headed toward the exit of the room, but instead of heading toward the bathroom, I noticed her slip into the kitchen. Something about her demeanor made me wary. Do you mind if I give you a present too? Audrey asked, distracting me from my observation. Sure, I turned to her. She handed me a small envelope. Nothing fancy, just tickets to the jazz band concert next month. I thought we could both use a cultural program. I was touched. Audrey knew how much I loved jazz and how rarely I got out of work or home. Sinamin, thank you. I shook her hand. I'd love to go with you. If you say no, I'll find a younger man. She winked. I grinned, but my attention was caught again by movement in the kitchen. Helen came out of there, holding something that she quickly stashed in her purse. Her face was pale and her movements were abrupt. Meanwhile, Aidan, finally free of Bradley, headed to the bar for another drink. I decided to seize the moment and approach him. How's the company doing? I asked, standing next to him at the bar. Aidan gave me a brief glance. It's okay. I heard about the remodeling contract. Congratulations. It's a serious project. Yeah, he poured himself another whiskey. Not as serious as the ones you've dealt with, but it's significant to me. There was a bitterness in his voice that I'd heard many times before. Aidan always thought I was judging his accomplishments with condescension, comparing them to my own. I'm not comparing, Aidan, I said quietly. I'm genuinely pleased with your progress. He grinned. Of course. That's why you've never visited any of my facilities. That was a low blow. I hadn't really been to any of his construction sites, but not for lack of interest. I didn't think you wanted me to, I replied. Amma, you always made it clear that you preferred to keep your work separate from me. And you never asked. We stood side by side, two stubborn people, too similar to find common ground and too different to understand each other. I could come down next week, I suggested. See your office, meet the team. Aidan looked at me in surprise. Then his gaze slid to Helen, who had returned to the room and was now talking to Bradley's wife. I don't think that's a good idea, he said finally. We've got a lot of work to do right now. Maybe we'll do it later. I nodded, feeling the wall of alienation grow between us again. At that moment, Audrey came over with her camera. Let's take a picture of father and son. Phew, she was smiling cheerfully, but I could see the worry in her eyes. I'm not very photogenic. Aidan tried to refuse, but Audrey was insistent. Nonsense. Just stand next to me and smile. It's Norman's birthday. Reluctantly, Aidan stood next to me. I could feel the tension radiating from his body. Once upon a time, he'd loved having his picture taken with me. I still had a picture of 5-year-old Aidan sitting on my shoulders at the zoo, smiling broadly. What happened to that happy little boy? Say cheese, Audrey commanded. Cheese, Aidan and I said without enthusiasm, and a flash lit up our faces. Great! Audrey looked at the picture. I'll have something to show my grandchildren. Aidan tensed even more. The subject of children was a sensitive one for him and Helen. As far as I knew, they'd been trying to have a child for several years, but without success. Another area where we'd never talked openly. I apologize. Aidan stepped back, heading over to Helen, who was now standing alone looking at her phone. I saw them exchange a few sentences. Helen showed him something on the screen, and Aidan's face grew even more grim. He nodded, then glanced at his watch, as if counting down to something. Meanwhile, the guests kept coming up to me with gifts. Colleagues from the investment company gave me an expensive engraved watch. Friends from the golf club gave me a new set of clubs. Neighbors gave me a rare collector's wine. I thanked each of them, keeping up the conversation, but my gaze kept returning to Aidan and Helen. They kept to themselves, occasionally chatting and checking the time. Once Helen pulled an envelope out of her purse, showed it to Aidan, then quickly put it back. Norman, would you like to say a few more words? One of my old friends suggested. Tell the story about the time we got stuck in an elevator in Chicago. I smiled, remembering that incident from 30 years ago. It was in '85, I began. And Thomas and I had gone to an important meeting in Chicago. Right before the presentation, we were stuck in the hotel elevator for 20 minutes. When we finally got out and ran into the conference room, it turned out that our competitors were also late. Their cab had been in an accident. We won that contract, and I'm still not sure if it was luck or fate. The guests laughed, and I raised my glass. Here's to happy accidents in life. Everyone drank, and I noticed that Aidan raised his glass too, though he wasn't smiling. Audrey came over to me and said quietly, there are a few more presents left, and then we can relax a bit. You're holding up well. I nodded gratefully. Without her, this evening would have been much harder. The gifts kept coming. Each time I accepted another gift, I glanced at Aiden, waiting for him to join in the ritual. But he continued to stand off to the side, watching with an unreadable expression on his face. Helen walked over to the appetizer table and picked up an olive. I noticed her fingers trembling. Something was definitely bothering her. I remembered Audrey's words about seeing them arguing in town. Could it be that they were having relationship problems? Or was it about Aiden's business? When the bulk of the gifts had been handed out, Ray Gilmore announced loudly, "It seems like everyone had a chance to congratulate Norman. How about some music now?" He headed over to the music center to change a record. At that moment, Aiden finally separated himself from the wall and stepped forward. "Not quite all of it," he said loudly. "I have a present for my dad, too." The room fell silent. Everyone turned to Aiden, who looked at Helen. She nodded and pulled the very envelope I'd noticed earlier out of her purse. I felt my heart beat a little faster. Something about my son's behavior made me tense. It wasn't just a gift. There was some subtext to it. Aiden took the envelope from Helen and walked over to me. His face was calm, but I noticed a strange glint in his eyes, a mixture of determination and something else I couldn't quite pinpoint. "Happy birthday, Father," he said, holding out an envelope to me. "I've been thinking about what to get you for a long time. The man who has everything. And I thought it was time to return an old debt." The guests watched us with interest. Audrey was standing next to me, and I could see the worry on her face. The envelope was thick, good quality, unmarked. I took it, feeling an inexplicable heaviness in my hand. Whatever was inside, I knew it would change the evening, and possibly our relationship. "Open it," Aiden said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you'll like it." I took the envelope, feeling the stares of all the guests. There was an unnatural silence in the room, as if before a thunderstorm. Even the music seemed to be quieter. The envelope was heavier than I'd expected. It was clearly more than just a greeting card. "Open it, Father," Aiden said again, a note of impatience in his voice. "Don't keep the guests waiting." I opened the envelope slowly, trying to keep a calm expression on my face. Inside was a folded piece of paper, designed as an official document. I unfolded it and began to read. With each line, my heart beat harder, but I tried not to show emotion. It was a detailed invoice. It meticulously listed all the expenses that Aiden had estimated as the cost of raising, educating, and supporting him from birth to adulthood. Private school, summer camps, college, his first car, health insurance, food, clothing. Everything was converted to cash and totaled. The total at the end of the document was $850,000. "What is this?" I asked, even though I understood the meaning of the document perfectly. Aiden smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "It's a bill, Father, for everything you've spent on me. I thought it was time to return the favor." He raised his voice so all the guests could hear him. "You always said you had to pay your bills in life, didn't you?" "Nothing comes for free, Aiden. Remember that." Whispers were heard in the room. The faces of the guests expressed embarrassment and awkwardness. Audrey took a step in my direction, but I shook my head faintly, stopping her. "We counted everything down to the cent," Aiden continued. "Helen's been working on it for weeks. Even found your old financial records you kept in the garage." I shifted my gaze to Helen. She was standing next to Aiden, but she wasn't looking me in the eye. Her face was pale, and her fingers were nervously clutching the strap of her purse. $850,000, Aiden said the amount with emphasis. "That's how much you've invested in me in 18 years. Impressive, isn't it?" He looked around at the guests. "My father was always meticulous about finances. Every dollar counted." I felt anger rising inside me, but I held back. Instead of answering, I walked over to the drinks table and poured myself a glass of red wine. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw some of the guests begin to talk quietly, clearly feeling uncomfortable. "Aiden, maybe this isn't a good time." Audrey started, but Aiden interrupted her. "No, it's exactly the right time. Birthdays are a great time to take stock, aren't they, Dad?" He looked at me challengingly. "You like numbers and reports, don't you?" I took a sip of wine, feeling the tart flavor on my tongue. I needed to buy some time, gather my thoughts. I'd expected a trick from my son, but not such a public humiliation. An interesting gift, I said at last, trying to speak calmly. I would have preferred a tie, though. A few of the guests laughed uncertainly, but the atmosphere remained tense. I want everyone to know how practical you've always been, Aiden continued, ignoring my attempt to lighten the mood. You've always treated fatherhood like an investment. You put money into me, expecting a return, but you forgot to invest the most important thing of all, your time and attention. His words hurt more than I expected, because there was some truth to them. I did miss out on a lot of things by getting caught up in my work and career. I remember when you missed my high school graduation because of an important meeting, Aiden continued, not so much to me as to the guests. I remember when you forgot to pick me up from soccer practice, and I waited in the rain for 2 hours. I remember when you didn't show up at the hospital when I had my appendix removed because you were in Boston for a conference. Every word hit exactly on target. I did make all those mistakes and many others, but now was not the time for self-abuse. I finished my wine and set my glass on the table. If you're done listing my parenting failures, I said, maybe we should continue this conversation in private. Why? Aiden raised his eyebrows. Shouldn't your friends know what you're really like? A successful investment analyst who couldn't invest in his own family. I saw some of the guests begin to move quietly toward the exit, feeling like unwilling witnesses to a family drama. Ray Gilmore tried to intervene. Maybe we should give you two time to talk. There's no need, I held up my hand, stopping him. Aiden wants publicity, so be it. I calmly walked over to my jacket hanging on the back of my chair and pulled several folded sheets of paper from the inside pocket. I'd been preparing for this conversation longer than Aiden could have imagined. You know, son, I said, unfolding the papers, you're right. I've been working a lot and not spending enough time with you. That's my fault and my regret. But you're wrong if you think I didn't keep track of your life. I was always aware of what was going on, even when you thought I was away. I looked around the room. I apologize to everyone here for this awkward situation. I promise we can get back to celebrating soon. Then I turned to Aiden. You're talking about a debt of $850,000. That's a lot of money. But I'm afraid your company doesn't have that kind of money right now. I handed him the first sheet. This is Parker Construction's financial report for the last quarter. The numbers aren't very good, are they? Aiden took the sheet, and I saw his face change. He hadn't expected me to be so well informed about the state of his business. Where did you get this information? His voice sounded hoarse. I still have friends in the financial world, I answered. And when your company started showing signs of instability, I decided to take a closer look. I handed him a second document. This is the corporate cash flow report for the last 6 months. Pay attention to these transactions. I pointed to a few lines in the document. Regular transfers to an account in the Cayman Islands. Interesting strategy for a construction company from Kansas, don't you think? Aiden turned pale. His gaze flicked to Helen, who now looked even more tense. Her hands were trembling visibly. That's privileged information, Aiden hissed. You have no right to. I have every right to inquire about the financial situation of a company I invested $500,000 in 7 years ago, I interrupted him. Or have you forgotten who your first investor was? That was a low blow. Aiden had indeed started the business with my help, though he'd later bought out my share, insisting on complete independence. I turned to Helen. You're an excellent accountant, Helen, very resourceful. But you forgot to consider that some banks automatically send notices to major investors for suspicious transactions, even former ones. Helen's face turned white as chalk. She took a step back, as if trying to blend in with the wall. I don't know what you mean, she said, but her voice shook. Do you? I held up the third document. Then perhaps you can explain these transfers to a personal account in your name? Almost $200,000 in the last year. Money from your husband's company, which is on the verge of bankruptcy. The room became so quiet you could hear the ticking of the wall clock. The guests froze, watching the unfolding drama with a mixture of horror and curiosity. Aiden turned sharply to his wife. What is he saying, Helen? She opened her mouth but couldn't utter a word. Her eyes filled with tears. I can explain, she finally squeezed out. Later, I interrupted her gently but firmly. Right now, my son and I weren't done talking. I turned my attention back to Aiden, who now looked confused and angry at the same time. You're talking about debt, son, about what I've invested in you. But you're forgetting one important detail. I pulled the last document from the stack. The house you and Helen have lived in for the last 5 years. The one I helped you buy. Legally, I still own it. I handed him a deed. A copy of the real estate deed with my name as the owner. I deeded the house to myself so you could save on taxes in the early years of your marriage. We agreed that we'd reissue the property later, but you were so busy with your business that we never made it to a lawyer. Aiden stared at the document, and I could see the paint finally peeling off his face. He realized that his plan to humiliate me had backfired on himself. You knew all along? His voice was barely audible. Not everything, I shook my head. I only found out about the company's money scam a month ago. But I knew your business was in trouble, and I wanted to help. I was going to talk to you after your birthday, offer you a solution, but you decided to put on this show. I paused, looking at my son with sadness. You wanted to show that I'm a bad father. Well, you're right. I've missed a lot of things, done a lot of things wrong, but I never stopped caring about you, even when you pushed me away. Aiden stood, clutching the papers in his hands, his shoulders slumped. For the first time all evening, the mask of confidence and superiority was gone from his face, revealing a confused man who had just realized the extent of his problems. Helen went over to him and tried to take his hand, but he yanked it away as if he'd been burned. Not now, he hissed. I turned back to the guests, many of whom stood in a daze, unsure how to react. Sonim, I apologize for this unpleasant digression from the festivities, I said calmly. Maybe we should take a break. Audrey, could you take the guests into the garden? It should be cooler there. Audrey, bless her heart, was instantly receptive to the idea. Of course, there's a table set up on the terrace with desserts and champagne. Let's give the family some time. The guests began to move towards the garden exit with obvious relief. After a few minutes, it was just me, Aiden, and Helen. Now we can talk, I said, pointing to the sofa. Have a seat. Aiden didn't move. Why did you do that? He asked through gritted teeth. Why did you humiliate us in front of everyone? Me? I raised my eyebrows. I think it was you who brought an $850,000 bill to my birthday party and announced it in front of everyone. That's different, Aiden shook his head. You've been spying on me, on my business. You've been poking around in my life. I was watching, I corrected, and it's a good thing I was. Otherwise, you wouldn't know now that your wife was taking money out of the company. Helen shuddered as if struck by a blow. It's not what you think, she said in a shaky voice. I had my reasons. What reasons could there be for stealing money from your own husband? I asked sharply. Aiden turned to Helen, his eyes narrowed. Yes, Helen, I'd love to hear those reasons. She looked cornered. Her gaze darted between Aiden and me as if she were searching for an escape route. Yeah, I've been building up the emergency fund, she finally said. The company's in bad shape. You know that, Aiden. I was afraid we were going to lose everything. So you accelerated the process by withdrawing the money? Aiden looked at her in disbelief. I wanted to protect us, Helen exclaimed. We have no children, no heirs. If the company goes bankrupt, what will we have left? I watched this exchange, feeling a strange mixture of regret and satisfaction. Aiden's plan to humiliate me had turned out to expose his own wife's betrayal. The house, I said calmly. You'll still have the house, which, as we just discovered, belongs to me. Aiden turned to me sharply. What are you going to do? Kick us out? I shook my head. No, son. I'm going to help you save the company and the marriage, if you let me. But first, we need to deal with the real problem, which isn't money or the house. I walked over to Aiden and put my hand on his shoulder. The problem is that you've never forgiven me for being an absentee father, and I realize that. But revenge won't heal your wounds, Aiden. He dropped my hand and took a step back. Tears of anger and humiliation glistened in his eyes. Don't you dare lecture me. Not now. He turned to Helen. We're leaving. Aiden, I tried to stop him. We need to talk about what to do next. I'll take care of my own problems, he cut him off, heading for the door. As always. Helen followed him, throwing one last look at me, a mixture of fear and gratitude. I wasn't sure. As they walked out, I sank into a chair, feeling suddenly tired. The birthday party definitely hadn't gone according to plan, But perhaps it was a necessary catharsis, an opening of the pustule that had poisoned our relationship for too long. I glanced at the papers scattered across the table. I doubt Aiden realized how close his company had come to collapse, and how much I'd done to prevent it, acting quietly behind the scenes, as I'd been accustomed to doing all my life. Audrey peered into the room from the terrace. "They're gone," I nodded. "Huh, the guests are asking if they should leave too," she said quietly. "No," I stood up, squaring my shoulders. "Tell them we'll continue the celebration. It was my 68th birthday after all." I smiled at Audrey, though I knew the smile didn't reach my eyes. That was an interesting gift from Aiden. Not what I was expecting, but perhaps the one I needed. The evening came to an end faster than I expected. After the dramatic confrontation with Aiden and Helen, the guests began to disperse, despite my assurances that the party could go on. They were uncomfortable, and I understood. No one wants to witness someone else's family drama, especially one so blatant. Ray and Lois Gilmore were the last to leave. Lois hugged me goodbye and whispered, "If you need anything, just give me a call. Anytime." Ray shook my hand with an awkward smile. "Strong performance, Norman. I always knew you weren't the type to be easily embarrassed." I nodded gratefully to both of them. True friendships are made at times like this. When they left, it was just Audrey and me. She was silently collecting glasses and plates, setting them on trays. I went to the bar and poured myself a whiskey, a double shot this time. "Leave it," I told her. "The cleanup could wait until tomorrow." Audrey shook her head. "No, I need something to keep my hands busy. Otherwise, I'll start saying things I'll regret." I knew what she meant. Audrey had always defended me, even when I didn't deserve it. But now she was angry at everyone. At Aiden for his cruelty, at Helen for her betrayal, and even at me for letting it happen. "Did you know?" she asked, not looking up. "About Helen taking money out of the company?" I suspected. I took a sip of whiskey, feeling the alcohol burn my throat. "A month ago, I got a call from Martin at the bank. Said he'd noticed some strange transactions and thought I should know, given my past involvement with the company." Audrey shook her head. "And you decided to keep it to yourself instead of talking to Aiden right away?" "So, I was going to." I rubbed the bridge of my nose, feeling a headache coming on. I wanted to gather more information, to be sure. And frankly, I'd been looking for the right moment. "And now it was," Audrey grinned bitterly. "On your birthday, in front of all your friends." I couldn't blame her for being sarcastic. The situation had gotten out of hand precisely because I'd put off talking to my son for too long. The sound of a car pulling up interrupted our conversation. I went to the window and saw Aiden's familiar black SUV. "They're back," I said, feeling my heart start to beat faster. Audrey set the tray of dishes aside and fixed her hair. "Do you want me to leave?" I shook my head. "No, stay. We might need a sane person in the room." The door opened and Aiden walked in first, followed by Helen. Both looked exhausted, as if they had lived a whole day in the hour that had passed since they had left. Helen seemed to be crying. Her eyes were red and puffy. Aiden was holding himself upright, but his face looked gaunt. "We've decided to go back," he said without preamble. "We need to talk." I nodded and pointed to the couch. "Have a seat. Would you like something to drink?" Aiden shook his head and Helen asked quietly, "Water, if that's okay." Audrey went into the kitchen, and the three of us remained in awkward silence. I sat down across from them, still holding the whiskey glass in my hand. "I talked to Helen," Aiden finally began, "about the company's money." I waited for him to continue without interrupting. Audrey came back with a glass of water for Helen and sat down next to me. "She confirmed what you said." Aiden's voice was dry, devoid of emotion. "About the transfers. About the account in the Cayman Islands." Helen stared at the floor, clutching the glass so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Helen," I addressed her directly, "why?" She looked up, and I saw fear mixed with determination. "The company is sinking, Norman. It's been sinking for over a year." Aiden didn't want to admit it. Kept taking on new projects even when he couldn't pay for the old ones. "We owed suppliers, workers." Her voice shook. "I tried to build up an emergency fund, so we'd have something when everything fell apart." "You could have just told me about it." Aiden's voice sounded pained. We could have looked for a solution together. I tried, Helen exclaimed. Many times. But you wouldn't listen. You always said you could handle it, that the new contract would fix everything. You're just like your father, stubborn to the point of insanity. I felt something tighten in my chest at those words. Had my son really inherited my worst traits? What happened to the company? I asked. The last time I checked, things were going well. Aiden grinned bitterly. That was before the pandemic, before the price of materials doubled, before 3 of our biggest clients went bankrupt, leaving us with unfinished projects and unpaid bills. I listened and realized he was right. The market had changed and many construction companies were on the verge of survival. But another thing bothered me. Why didn't you ask for help? Not to me if it's so hard for you to ask me for anything, but there are banks, investors. With my credit history, Aiden shook his head. After that failed project in Topeka, no bank will give me a big loan, and investors want too big a share. I could see the pride in his eyes, the same pride that kept him from asking for help, even when he desperately needed it, a pride he had undoubtedly inherited from me. Showing, and instead of finding a solution together, I shifted my gaze to Helen. You decided to secretly withdraw the money from the company? Helen straightened. I did what I thought was necessary for our survival. The company's going to go bankrupt anyway, Norman. It's only a matter of time. I wanted us to have something to start over with. At the expense of your employees? Suppliers? I shook my head. That money could be used to pay off your debts, to pay the salaries of the people who work for you. Don't lecture me, Helen snapped at me. You're the one who always told Aiden to think of himself first in business. Isn't that how you made your millions? Aiden put his hand on his wife's knee, stopping her. That's enough, Helen. That's not why we're here. He turned to me. I need to know what you're going to do with the house. And with the information about Helen. I sipped my whiskey, feeling bitter from more than just the drink. My son hadn't come to me to reconcile, to mend relationships. He came to negotiate like a business partner. With the house? I put my glass on the table. I've been thinking about it all night, and I've made a decision. I paused, looking at them both. I'm going to sell it. Helen gasped, and Aiden stepped forward. What? You can't just... I can, I interrupted him. I legally own the house. We both know that. Where are we supposed to go? Helen sounded afraid. I shrugged. You have money in the Caymans. I think it's enough for a down payment on a new place. Aiden clenched his fists. You're doing this out of spite, aren't you? Because of that stupid bill I showed you? No, I shook my head. I'm doing this because the house is worth almost $1 million, and that money could be put to better use. I've decided to donate it to the renovation of Lawrence High School, the same one you went to. Aiden looked at me in disbelief. High school? Why? They need a new gym. I stood up and walked to the window. The one where you won your first silver medal is still leaking, and the computer lab is running on equipment from 10 years ago. I turned to him. Remember Mrs. Brooks, your literature teacher? She still teaches there. I talked to her last week. She told me that the school is woefully underfunded. Aiden looked confused. Are you in touch with my former teacher? I keep in touch with a lot of people in your life, I said calmly. Your first soccer coach. With the principal of the college you went to. Even Tommy Blackwood, your best friend from high school. He's on the city council now, you know. I could see the look of understanding on Aiden's face. All these years, while he thought I was ignoring his life, I'd been quietly watching from the sidelines, gathering information, keeping in touch. Why? He asked quietly. Why were you doing this? Because you're my son, I answered simply. And I wanted to know what was going on with you, even if you didn't want to tell me. There was a heavy silence in the room. Helen sat with her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold. Audrey watched us silently, ready to intervene if the conversation went down the wrong path. Let's get back to the house, Aiden said finally. Are you really going to kick us out? After everything that happened today? I shook my head. Not right away. You'll have 3 months to find a new place to live. I think that's enough time. And the company? Helen asked. Are you going to tell everyone about what I did? I looked at her with a long look. Not if you return the money to the company, every last dime. That's impossible, she shook her head. I've already used some of the money to pay my debts. Then pay back what's left, I was adamant. And I want to see all the financial documents of the company. Maybe there's more to come. Aiden looked at me suspiciously. What are you up to? So, I want to help you save your business, I said. If you'll let me. Why would you do that? He sounded distrustful. So you can brag about how a great father saved an ungrateful son? His words hurt me, but I tried not to show it. No, Aiden, because I want to right some of my wrongs. And because despite everything that's happened between us, you're still my son. And I love you. Aiden turned away, but not before I noticed the glint of tears in his eyes. He always hated to show weakness, especially in front of me. I didn't ask for your help, he said quietly. I know, I sighed, but sometimes we need help, even if we don't want to admit it. I learned that lesson too late. I hope you'll be smarter than that. Helen put her hand on her husband's shoulder. Aiden, we need to think about employees, about the people who depend on the company. He didn't answer, continuing to look away. His pride was struggling with practicality, and I understood that internal battle all too well. Why didn't you ever come to my school events? He suddenly asked, turning to me. Why was it always work, meetings, conferences? If I was so important to you, why were you never around? There it was, the question that had been hanging between us for years. I took a deep breath, realizing I had to answer honestly. Because I was afraid, I admitted, afraid I wouldn't be a good enough father. That I wouldn't be good enough, like my own father was. The job was easier, with clear rules, clear goals. But fatherhood. I didn't know how to do it right. I looked him in the eye. That's not an excuse. It's just an explanation. I was wrong, and now I regret it every day. Aiden was silent for a long moment, digesting what he'd heard. Then he said, that bill, I wasn't going to give it to you. It was Helen's idea. She thought it would make you feel guilty and help us with the money. Helen flinched and gave her husband a hurt look, but she didn't deny it. And you agreed? I asked, feeling the disappointment building up inside me. I was desperate, Aiden said. The company was on the verge of collapse. My wife was withdrawing money behind my back. I thought I had nothing left to lose. I shook my head. There's always something to lose, son, like self-respect. Aiden lowered his eyes. I know, and I'm ashamed. That confession, simple and honest, hit me harder than anything that had happened all night. My stubborn, proud son had admitted his mistake. Shimmeringly, well, I straightened up. I think we all need some time to think about the situation. I suggest we meet in a week and discuss a plan of action to save the company. In the meantime, I turned to Helen, I want all the transfer and account documents on my desk by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Helen nodded without looking up. Okay. And about the house, I added, my decision is final. It will be sold, and the money will go to the school. But I'll help you find a new place to live. Aiden stood up, his face tired, but calm. We understand. Thank you for your honesty. He held out his hand, and I shook it, feeling oddly relieved. It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a step in the right direction. Happy birthday, Father, Aiden said quietly. I'm sorry for ruining the evening. It's okay, I smiled weakly. It had been more informative than I'd expected. They left, leaving Audrey and me in the silence of the living room. She came over and put her hand on my shoulder. Are you sure about the house? It's a pretty drastic decision. I nodded. I'm sure. The school really needs the money, and Aiden needs a lesson. You can't build your life on someone else's foundation. Audrey sighed. Do you think they have a chance to save the company? There is, I nodded. If Aiden would let go of his pride and let me help. If Helen gives the money back. And if they start talking to each other honestly. That's a lot of ifs, Audrey said. Life is made up of ifs, I shrugged. But I have faith in my son. He's stronger and smarter than he thinks he is. He's nothing like me in that. Audrey smiled softly and squeezed my hand. You're not so bad, Norman Parker. At least you're trying to right your wrongs. Not many people are capable of that. I looked at the empty living room, at the signs of a celebration that hadn't gone according to plan, and realized that this was a birthday I would remember forever. Not because of the drama or the conflict, but because it was the first time in years that my son and I started talking to each other for real. It's been 3 months since that memorable birthday. Winter had given way to early spring, and the first timid flowers were beginning to break through the ground in the garden of the house that no longer belonged to me. I stood in the driveway, examining the facade one last time. Tomorrow a new family would move in here, a young couple with 2 children who had bought the house at just above market value. They didn't know the extra money went straight to the Lawrence High School fund for a new gym. And while everything's loaded, Norman, Audrey came up behind me and put her hand on my shoulder. The movers are asking if there's anything else. I shook my head. No, that's it. The rest I gave away or threw away. Audrey nodded, understanding my mood. She herself had recently sold her house, deciding to move to Santa Fe with me. New city, new life, she said then, suggesting the move to me. And I agreed, realizing there were too many ghosts of the past in Lawrence. Are you sure about this? She asked, looking at the envelope in my hand. I nodded. I'm sure. It's the last thing I have to do before I leave. The envelope contained a letter for Aiden and a check for $850,000, exactly the amount he'd billed me for raising him. I planned to leave the envelope in his office before I left. The last 3 months had been eventful. Aiden and I had met several times since my birthday to discuss company business. The conversations were dry, businesslike, unemotional. I helped him restructure his debts, find new clients, and most importantly, convinced him to accept an investment from an anonymous business angel, which of course was myself, acting through my old colleague Martin. Helen kept her promise and returned most of the money she had taken out of the company. It turned out that she had actually used some of the funds to pay off critical debts that Aiden hadn't even realized she had incurred. Their relationship remained strained, but they continued to live together, trying to rebuild trust. As promised, the house was sold and Aiden and Helen moved into a modest apartment on the outskirts of Lawrence. It was a serious blow to their lifestyle and status, but Aiden accepted the situation with a dignity that surprised me. He never once asked to change his mind, though I could see how hard it was for him to say goodbye to a home he considered his own. The car's here, Audrey said, pointing to the cab at the gate. We'd better get going if we were going to make it to Aiden's office before the flight. I nodded, taking one last look at the house where I'd lived most of my life. Strangely, I didn't feel sadness, just a slight relief, as if a heavy weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The cab took us to the small office building in the business district where Aiden's company was located. The Parker construction sign looked new. Apparently, some of the investment had gone into a new image. Would you wait in the car? I asked Audrey. She nodded. Sure, but don't be long. We have a plane in 3 hours. I got out of the cab and headed toward the building. I was greeted at the front desk by a young girl I didn't know. What can I do for you? She asked with a professional smile. I'd like to drop off an envelope for Aiden Parker, I replied. That's personal. Mr. Parker's on site right now, the girl said. If you'd like, I can let him know you're here. I hesitated. I had planned to just leave the envelope and walk away, avoiding a potentially awkward encounter. That won't be necessary, I began, but a voice behind me interrupted me. Father? I turned around and saw Aiden standing in the doorway of one of the offices. He looked better than the last time I'd seen him. His suit fit perfectly, and he had that same glint of confidence in his eyes. Hi, Aiden, I nodded. I didn't mean to bother you. I just wanted to drop something off before I left. Leaving? He frowned. Where? Santa Fe, I answered. Audrey and I decided to move. New start and all. Aiden looked surprised. You sold the house and now you're leaving town? Without telling me? I left a message on your answering machine 3 days ago, I said, feeling a slight pang of guilt. You didn't call me back, so I thought. Aiden shook his head. I was at a facility in Topeka. I just got back yesterday. There was an awkward pause. The secretary averted her eyes tactfully, pretending to be busy with her work. Why don't you come in? Aiden finally suggested, pointing to his office. Just for a couple of minutes. I hesitated, but then nodded. Okay, but not for long. The cab's waiting, and we have a flight coming up. Aiden's office was spacious, with large windows facing the street. There were pictures of the company's completed projects on the walls, And on the desk was a model of the new shopping center, the same one whose renovation contract had saved the company from bankruptcy. It looks impressive, I nodded at the model. How's the project going? Good, Aiden pointed to the chair across from his desk. We're 2 weeks ahead of schedule. The client is pleased. I sat down, placing the envelope in front of me. Glad to hear it. How's the new investment? Are they helping? Aiden grinned. Very much so. Although I still don't know who the mystery investor is who agreed to such favorable terms for me. I tried to keep a neutral expression on my face. Probably someone who believes in your potential. Aiden looked at me carefully. Maybe. Or someone who thinks he owes me a favor. I didn't bother to respond to that transparent hint. Instead, I pushed the envelope toward him. I came to drop this off. I wanted to just pass it on through the secretary, but since we're meeting, Aiden took the envelope, but didn't open it. What is it? You'll read it when I leave. I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. I'm glad the company is doing well, and that you handled the situation. Aiden stood up too. Handled it? I had no choice. You sold the house we were living in. You got Helen to pay the money back to the company? He paused. Although I have to admit it worked. The company's in better shape now than it was a year ago. And how are you and Helen? I couldn't resist asking. Are you getting along? Aiden shrugged. Day by day, moving into a small apartment was a real shock to her. But we're working on the relationship. She signed up for therapy, and so have I. That admission surprised me. Aiden had always been skeptical of psychological help, seeing it as a sign of weakness. That's good, I said sincerely. Therapy can help. I went myself for a few years after your mom died. Now it was Aiden's turn to wonder. Really, you never talked about it. We didn't tell each other a lot of things. I smiled sadly. One of the reasons why we ended up where we did. Aiden nodded, agreeing with that simple truth. Where exactly in Santa Fe are you moving to? He asked after a pause. We bought a small house in El Dorado. Nothing fancy, but with a nice view of the mountains. I smiled. Audrey always wanted to live somewhere with more sun. You and her? Aiden hesitated. Are you two a couple now? I nodded. Yeah, you could say that. Although at our age, it sounds a little weird. I'm happy for you, Aiden said. And surprisingly, I sensed that he sounded sincere. She's a good woman. Always been good to you. Yeah, that's true. I looked at my watch. I gotta go. The cab is waiting, and Audrey will be worried. Aiden nodded and suddenly held out his hand to me. Good luck with your new life, Dad. I shook his hand, feeling a strange mix of sadness and hope. You too, son. Take care of yourself and Helen. I headed for the door but stopped on the threshold. You can always call, if you need advice or just to talk. Aiden nodded. I know, maybe I will. We both realized that this maybe was more of a courtesy than a promise, but it was still more than we had before. I walked out of the office and got into a cab where Audrey was waiting. How did it go? She asked, squeezing my hand. Better than I expected, I replied, looking at the office building as the cab pulled away. It's looking good. The company is rebuilding. Did you tell him you're the anonymous investor? I shook my head. No. He guesses, but I haven't confirmed. It's better for his pride. And the letter? Audrey raised an eyebrow. Are you sure it was the right decision? I don't know, I admitted honestly. But it's what I had to do. For myself, if not for him. The cab pulled onto the highway leading to the airport, and I thought about Aiden, left in his office with my envelope. How would he feel when he read the letter and saw the check? Anger? Resentment? Or maybe realize what I was trying to say? At the airport, we quickly checked in and headed toward the departure area. I looked back at the city that had been my home for most of my life. Strangely, I didn't feel nostalgic, just light and excited for a new chapter. Ready? Audrey asked when our flight boarding was announced. I smiled at her. Never better. At the same time, Aiden sat at his desk, staring at the open envelope. He hadn't dared to look at the contents for a long time after I'd left, minding his own business. But curiosity eventually won out. In the envelope, he found a folded piece of paper and a check. Unfolding the sheet, he began to read, Dear Aiden, by the time you read this letter, Audrey and I will be on our way to our new home in Santa Fe. Don't worry, I've left all the contacts with Martin in case you need to contact me about company business. I've been thinking for a long time about what to say goodbye to you. We've never been good at expressing our feelings, neither you nor I. Perhaps it's a family trait passed down from father to son, along with stubbornness and a tendency to keep things to ourselves. I enclose a check for the amount you stated in your bill, $850,000. Not because I think I owe you that money, and not because I want to absolve myself of my guilt. It's because I want you to understand that real parenthood can't be measured in money. I didn't spend that money on your upbringing because I thought it was an investment with an expected return. I did it because you are my son, and I wanted to give you the best. Yes, I made mistakes. A lot of mistakes. I missed important events in your life. I put work before family. I didn't know how to express my love other than through material things. But know this, I've always been proud of you, even when I didn't say it, even when you thought I was criticizing you. I've admired your determination, your intelligence, your ability to accomplish goals. You're a better man than I am, Aiden. You always have been. Use that money however you see fit. Invest it in the company, buy a new house, save it for the future. It's up to you. But remember, it's not a payment for the past. It's an investment in the future. Your future, which I hope will be happier than mine. I don't apologize and I don't expect reconciliation. Too much water has passed. Too many resentments have accumulated. But I want you to know that despite all our differences and conflicts, I loved you, always. And I will love you no matter what happens. Sincerely, your father, Norman. Aiden finished the letter and stared at the check lying in front of him for a long time. $850,000, a sum that could change his life. He could invest it in a company, as his father had suggested, or buy a new house, bring back the standard of living Helen was so accustomed to, or simply tear up the check, refusing the money out of pride. But instead, Aiden folded the letter and the check neatly and tucked them away in his desk drawer. Not to forget, but to keep, to have time to think, to reflect, maybe even reevaluate. He turned to the window and saw an airplane taking off into the sky. It was probably his father's flight to Santa Fe. Aiden didn't feel the urge to call and say goodbye again, but neither did the anger that had been simmering inside for so long. There was something else, not forgiveness, but not hatred either. Maybe acceptance, maybe understanding, or maybe just fatigue from fighting a fight that wasn't doing anyone any good. Aiden turned away from the window and went back to work. He had a lot on his plate. The company was rebuilding. New contracts needed attention. Life went on even if some of its chapters were closing for good. And in the sky over Kansas, the plane was gaining altitude, taking Audrey and me to a new life, a new beginning. I didn't know if I'd ever see my son again. I didn't know if he would read my letter with understanding or disdain. I didn't know if he would accept the money or refuse it, but I did what I could. The rest was out of my hands.